Welcome to the program. In a short while, you will hear from Dr. John C. McManus about his latest work, Fire and Fortitude. Before we get started, though, we'd like to address two things. One, the MacArthur Memorial is not a shrine to a perfect MacArthur. That would not be responsible public history, and it's not what General MacArthur wanted when he agreed to the formation of this museum and research center. And secondly, for many years, there has been a story that General MacArthur had an inappropriate relationship with a 16-year-old girl between his two marriages. This claim first appears in William Manchester's 1978 American Caesar and has been repeated by many scholars since. It is also a claim found in Fire and Fortitude. The woman in question, Isabel Rosario Cooper, was actually in her 20s during their relationship. Published family memoirs disputed Manchester's characterization that she was a 16-year-old girl and called that claim vulgar and salacious. More recently, Cooper's travel documents from the period have come to light, once again proving that she was in her 20s during the relationship. Now, that being said, the relationship appears to have been a disaster, and it reflects poorly on both parties. Now, many of you joining us are scholars, academics, writers, students, history buffs, and you know that writing history is an amazing adventure, but it's not easy. As historians, we use the evidence that we have. Sometimes we have a pretty complete picture, sometimes we don't. In this case, information about Miss Cooper's actual age only reached Dr. McManus after the publication of Fire and Fortitude. This new information now informs his interpretation of the Cooper-MacArthur relationship, and it doesn't detract from the main body of research in Fire and Fortitude. So now let's turn our attention to that, and please welcome Jim Zobel to introduce Dr. McManus.
Good evening, and thanks once again for joining us at the MacArthur Memorial. Tonight we're going to be joined by Dr. John C. McManus. John's the professor of military history at the Missouri University of Science and Technology. But since the late 1990s, John's written about 13 books on military history. Now, most of these have dealt with the war in Europe, 2007's Alamo and the Ardennes, 2012's September Hope, and 2014's The Dead and Those That Are About to Die. And these have all concentrated on the U.S. Army fighting man in the European theater of operations. But now John has turned his attention to the U.S. Army fighting forces in the Pacific. And Fire and Fortitude, the U.S. Army in the Pacific 1941 to 1943, is the first book in this trilogy that Dr. McManus is going to be putting out about U.S. Army in the Pacific. This book traces from the early days in Hawaii, the attack, December of 1941, and goes to the besieged forces on Bataan Corregidor. It'll follow the retreat through Burma, China, and then those counterattacks in Papua New Guinea and South Pacific and those frozen islands up in the Aleutians. Now, Dr. McManus spent about 2 weeks here and made about 30,000 photographs of the documents. So his research is thorough, and you're going to find a lot of new and really good information in this talk tonight. And so now we would like to welcome Dr. John C. McManus. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us tonight. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you tonight about the American experience in the Pacific Asia theater, specifically the role of the United States Army in the war against Japan, and my book, Fire and Fortitude, the U.S. Army in the Pacific War, 1941 to 1943. Greatly appreciate the invitation from the MacArthur Memorial folks to do this and to arrange it, Amanda Williams, and of course, Jim Zobel as well. And I also wanted to mention that just how much I enjoyed my on-site research there and how incredibly helpful Jim Zobel was. His expertise is just beyond belief. So it's an honor to talk with you and an honor to delve into this topic, which I think is important and I think is a bit misunderstood. You know, specifically, I wanted to address what I think is the popular perception nowadays that the United States Marine Corps fought the ground war in the Pacific for the Americans, and then the Navy did everything else. And that is just simply not the case. I mean, even though I've spoken with many people who are quite well informed on World War II who had that notion, I found, just how incorrect that is. And it's one of the things that animated me to write this book and the follow-on volume about the 1945 or 1945 period of the Army in the Pacific War. So in truth, 1.8 million American ground soldiers served in the Asia Pacific theater during World War II. That's the third largest land force that the United States has ever sent overseas to fight a war, behind only the World Wars I and II European theater armies. And I'm not even counting the Army Air Forces. Of course, the Air Force is part of the Army in World War II. So that number I just gave you, 1.8 million, does not even take into account, of course, the enormous aviation effort that went on in the Pacific and Asia as well. Actually, the Army, not the Marine Corps, carried out the vast majority of amphibious operations in the Pacific. During the entire war, the Marine Corps did 15. The Robert Eichelberger's 8th Army alone did 35 in the spring of 1945 in the Philippines. The Marine Corps mobilized 6 divisions at full strength, the largest the Corps has ever been, at full strength in World War II. But the Army had 21 divisions in the Pacific, plus regimental combat teams, tank battalions, engineer special brigades, all kinds of other combat-oriented manpower that was basically like several more divisions. So I'm speaking up here a little bit for guys like this, the sort of average GIs who I think really fought just as hard and just as well as those who fought on more famous battlefields like Normandy or in the Battle of the Bulge, but didn't necessarily have the, I don't know if we'd call it luck, but good fortune or whatever to have fought in places that are better known to posterity. And I think that it's fair to say, their service shaped and the war they fought has really helped shape our world today. And also, I think these images, I hope, give you a sense of just the environment in which they fought too, and just what a slog it was and how difficult the whole thing was. And I also want to underscore, my purpose is absolutely not to denigrate or belittle the United States Marine Corps and its massive contributions to Allied victory in World War II. Actually, quite the contrary, because I think that once you see the kind of broader picture of the Army's role in the Pacific, you come away with an even greater respect for what the Marine Corps is able to accomplish with so few troops. But I just wanted in this book and the follow-on volume is to perhaps contextualize the American war against Japan a little bit better than maybe we have before, and demonstrate that the two ground-oriented combat services fought extremely well, and they fought together, generally shoulder to shoulder, and they fought in a very similar fashion. But that nonetheless, the Army did, just by its very nature, the majority of the fighting and dying. So there was this particular book, Fire and Fortitude, stretches from Pearl Harbor through the invasion of Makin in November 1943. Makin happens in tandem with the more famous invasion of Tarawa by the 2nd Marine Division. So that's the end point for this book. And in between, you just see this sort of incredibly dramatic, I think, human epic in some ways. So when you look at the Army's experiences in the war against Japan, it takes you to a lot of different themes. It takes you to the sort of logistical story, transportation problems of amphibious warfare, inter-service problems, working with the Navy, working with the Marine Corps, the Army Air Forces, issues like race and the combat experience and leadership. You see this sort of provincial military force grow in the course of those couple of years of war into this complex military organization capable of carrying out really incredibly complicated military operations that almost had no precedent in previous history. And then you also see these kind of themes emerge, not just for its own sake of what's happening then, but these are themes that I think personally are still with us now in the 21st century in a very meaningful way. So for instance, the savagery of the fighting of the American-Japanese War really, I think it's fair to say, foretells what the fighting is going to be like in almost all subsequent American conflicts from Korea to the 21st century. And what I mean by that too is this is certainly an ideological and cultural clash, but there is, in the American view, no morality shown by the American opponents. The example, of course, most famous example is the deliberate killing of medical personnel, the deliberate killing of wounded and all that, which the Americans viewed as against the Geneva Convention, quite correctly. So you see this kind of kill or be killed, zero-sum type of warfare between the Americans and the Japanese that is quite similar to what has happened ever since. But it also forces the Americans to kind of struggle to maintain and define their own morality too. And you see that in the course of the Pacific War. And also, I would say too, with a few small exceptions like Panama, Grenada, Mogadishu, every subsequent American war has been fought somewhere on the Asian continent. So in a way, World War II leads us to Asia every bit as much as it does to Europe. And in terms of actual conflict, that's where the fighting is generally going to take place. And most of that fighting took place on the ground. About 90% of American war deaths have happened on the ground since World War II. And most of those war deaths have been Army deaths. You see in the Pacific Asia theater the crucial importance of understanding culture to have influence. So, for instance, you see Americans performing what a later generation will call like special forces type missions in places like Burma, in the South Pacific, and of course, most notably in the Philippines, where linguistic skills are important, cultural skills are important, influence among the population in guerrilla and counterinsurgent kind of war. All of that goes on in the course of World War II. You see the vital importance of inter-service coordination. No one's going anywhere without the Navy and naval supremacy in the Pacific theater, of course. And so Army leaders are going to have to understand that. And that's obviously of vital importance. Working together with the Marine Corps would be an example, as I had mentioned earlier. So the other thing too, allies, working with allies. The last war the United States has fought of any scale without allies has been the Spanish-American War, well over 100 years ago. So World War II obviously is an enormous allied effort, and the agendas may or may not be the same. So for instance, the alliance with Chiang Kai-shek's China is, I think we might agree, the most tragic in American history, and its ultimate failure has had tremendous and profound consequences that are still with us today. I think that's very fair to say in the 21st century. And it's a tragic alliance too, that it almost sort of foreshadows the American alliance with a South Vietnamese regime a generation or so later. So from an historian's viewpoint, there's just sort of these endless sort of fascinating base points in the Pacific War that have so much relevance to later generations and including today. So obviously it's a big book with a lot of different elements to the story, and my terrible dark agenda is always to get you to buy and read the book. But what I want to do tonight is just give you a few highlights that maybe give you shape the larger whole. And I thought that we'd start with the great elephant in the room, of course, General Douglas MacArthur. A man of, shall we say, outsized ego, maybe we put it that politely. MacArthur really is the key Army personality of the Pacific theater. Of course, there's no getting around that. And he'd had by the time World War II breaks out, he's had a long and fascinating career. He's obviously the son of a general, a West Pointer, a World War I war hero. He had been the youngest superintendent of West Point at the tender age of 39 and 40. In like 1919, 1920. He, of course, and his family, by the time MacArthur becomes a general and becomes Army Chief of Staff in the 1930s, he'd had a long association with the Philippines and a love of the people in its archipelago, people of the archipelago. And I think it's fair to say he'd had a obviously distinguished and remarkable career as a young chief of staff of the Army in the early 1930s. So like anybody who sort of tops out at an early age, the question is, what's next? And for MacArthur, what was next is that he accepts an invitation by an old friend of his, Manuel Quezon, who is president of the Philippines Commonwealth, to come to the Philippines in the second half of the decade of 1930s and attempt to build Filipino armed forces in preparation for the independence of the archipelago. The Senate had passed an act called the Tidings-McDuffie Act in 1934 that basically said, all right, we're going to give the Philippines its independence in 1946. And so in preparation for that, the Philippines needed its own armed forces. It already had its own sort of parliamentary body, a National Assembly, they called it. It had a president of like a Commonwealth president, but it was still subordinate to the United States as a kind of imperial holding, but one that was sort of half independent by the end of the decade. And so his job is a difficult one, to try and create military forces out of whole cloth, and to do this in the midst of the Depression, when military appropriations and budgets for the U.S. armed forces were minuscule, and much less what Congress might appropriate for the Philippines, a country that's about to get its independence, but one that is nonetheless right there in the way of the potential expansion of the Japanese empire, right on a collision course. So it's an uncomfortable situation. It's difficult to do in terms of dealing with the local politics too, because many Filipinos felt that whatever treasure they had should go towards establishing public programs and education and nice and more peaceful pursuits than armies. You of course have an incredible diversity in the archipelago of different ethnicities, different languages, different cultural base points, and so you as an American advisor working to create a Filipino army unit, and it's basically set up on a National Guard system. You might be working with people who speak a half a dozen languages, and so MacArthur has, I think it's fair to say, a very big job in trying to create these armed forces. But with that understood, he makes some pretty significant errors here, and one of the first is setting aside what's called War Plan Orange. War Plan Orange was a kind of long War Department and multi-service plan that said, okay, when and if war breaks out with Japan, what we're going to do, and if you sort of look here on Luzon, the largest and most important island in the Philippines, you can see over here the Bataan Peninsula opposite Manila. The Bataan Peninsula is good, rugged ground, good defensible ground. And so the War Department planners understand the Japanese are likely to get the first punch in here. And the Filipino armed forces are almost certainly not going to be prepared for the outbreak of war. So why not retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, hang on to Manila and Manila Bay, and wait for the United States Pacific Fleet to fight its way through to you after defeating the Imperial Navy in a big engagement. And so then you'll be able to reinforce the Philippines, and you'll be able to kind of reverse the tide of Japanese control. MacArthur will come to believe that his sort of nascent Phil-American army will be able to stop the Japanese anywhere that they hope to land. Mixture in some units. You have a few all-American units that have been sent there at the very, very last minute before Pearl Harbor happens, all this kind of stuff too. So a very tough go. But I think that the setting aside War Plan Orange just simply was not going to work out. The other mistake, of course, more famously, is the loss of much of the Air Force on the ground within about a day or two of Pearl Harbor. Now they're based, the heavy bombers are based here in the central part of Luzon. Okay, so when MacArthur loses about half of his air forces, and again, mostly on the ground, it basically means the Japanese are going to control the air around the Philippines, which means they're going to control the sea, which means they're going to be able to get ashore. So at that point, it's going to be very difficult for MacArthur's forces that are spread thin here and around Luzon and elsewhere to repel them at the waterline, and his entire strategy had predicated on that. Okay, so the consequence of this is really logistical, because if the army, instead of being concentrated at Bataan, is now spread all over Luzon and elsewhere, obviously then its supply nodes and depots and all its material has got to be spread out of those places too. Okay, so when you're unable to stop them at the waterline, which is precisely what happens once the Japanese invade in December, and the army begins to kind of just melt away, because many of the soldiers are not well armed, most of them are not that well trained. Many want to fight, but don't have a lot of means to do it, or they're confused or whatever. It begins to melt away, and the Japanese get ashore and set up air bases here and begin to control the air. You got a bad situation on your hands. And so by the end of December, by around Christmas time or so, MacArthur has realized this and has decided, okay, I'm going to go back to War Plan Orange, and I'm going to try and get my army to Bataan and hunker down there. He successfully does that, but he has to leave behind in the confusion most of the supplies. Example, 10 million pounds of rice at Cabanatuan, which is sort of in the central part of Luzon. That's left in place. It would have been hard to move it anyway, but President Kazan had wanted it to remain in place anyway because he felt that it would panic the population if the rice is moved to Bataan. But MacArthur would not countermand him. Would not even authorize the appropriation of thousands of cases of canned food that was in Japanese-owned warehouses in Manila. Bottom line for you is that by the time the army gets to Bataan in early January, the situation is practically hopeless. The Japanese forces, by the way, are in this campaign outnumbered about 2 to 1. There will be a kind of a myth that grows out of the first Philippines campaign, stoked by some of the communiques coming out of MacArthur's headquarters, that the Americans and the Filipinos are vastly outnumbered by this huge army and whatever. Actually, the Japanese are generally outnumbered about 2 to 1 throughout most of this campaign, and they have their own logistical issues and transportation issues and whatever, so they're not able to chase down and destroy this Allied army before it gets to Bataan. So by the time you're there, you're in a compromised, terrible logistical situation. MacArthur's quartermaster, a general named Charles Drake, estimated that the following was on hand by like the first week of January or so: 30 days of rations, 30 days of canned meat and fish, 40 days of canned milk, 30 days of flour, 30 days of canned beans and tomatoes, and 20 days of rice. So you'd wonder, well, what about local food sources? Well, it's not really an option. The army is slaughtering about 30 to 40 animals per day, but that amounts to about 6 ounces of meat per day per man at best. Japanese air attacks put an end to any attempts to do fishing in the local waters there, so that was cut off too. And then the other thing too is you got the local population, and they had to eat as well. So what that meant for you as one of those soldiers serving on Bataan is that you're down to about half rations and then even quarter rations by February or so. And yet the incredible thing about this is the army surprisingly fights very well. In tactical engagements, they generally hold their own very well with the Japanese. This army is not really defeated tactically, it's defeated logistically as much as anything. And there were instances during the Bataan campaign that spring of the Japanese suffering terrible disasters tactically, heavy casualties. They're going to try and launch several outflanking amphibious invasions that failed. And so it was called the Tuol Pocket, Tuol. And the Americans and Filipinos were just sort of eliminating these pockets of Japanese troops. And one of the really exciting things I think about this book, and I think about this story as a whole, is the availability of some excellent contemporary Japanese sources that have been translated into English, especially diaries. A lot of Japanese soldier diaries that they kept and that the Allies later captured. And so there was a lot of this great stuff that was very soul-searing, honestly. Found one from an Imperial Japanese Army doctor who was part of one of these cornered units in Bataan. And he wrote in his diary, he said, "I've made up my mind. I will not have a disgraceful ending. I went back to my patients and I told them it's better and more honorable to die with a pistol shot than to be captured." Right there, of course, too, that gives you a little insight into the Japanese propensity to kill themselves rather than surrender. And that'll go on, obviously, the whole war. The Japanese commander, General Hama, Homma, finds that his forces are racked by disease, by battle losses, and he has to ask for reinforcements, which was a humiliating thing, and really, hurt his standing within the upper reaches of the Imperial Japanese Army. But he does have the luxury, though, of hunkering down and eventually getting reinforced and resupplied. MacArthur doesn't have that because his people are more or less cut off in the Philippines. He was getting communications from Washington indicating that help was on the way, very disingenuous communications. He then also passed those on to his troops. And so as one of those starving guys, you have this maybe hope holding out that maybe help is coming from the U.S., but it really wasn't. This just simply was not a possibility. The general was physically located on Corregidor, an island right in the middle of Manila Bay, a fortified island. And routinely comported himself with courage and dignity. By all accounts, he lost 25 pounds during the fighting that went on at Corregidor those early weeks in 1942. And he has what is a unique worry that no other soldier under his command has. He's got his wife, his young wife Jean, and his young son Arthur with him, and that points out what I think is a bit of a real concern with MacArthur's leadership at this point. In the spring of 1941, when it became clear to American policymakers that war with Japan was a very serious possibility, the War Department ordered out all family members and dependents from the Philippines, knowing obviously that the Philippines were likely to become a battlefield. So everybody's family left except for MacArthur's. And that, to me, was a sort of a kind of a propensity to say, well, the rules apply to everyone else, but they don't necessarily apply to me. And so, of course, he couldn't help but be, extremely worried about what's going to happen to his wife and child, who are right there under bombardment, repeated bombardment during those days on Corregidor. Jean comports himself with great courage as well. But there's also too the sort of larger concern of American policymakers. What happens if they all fall in the Japanese hands? What are the Japanese going to do with MacArthur's wife? What are they going to do with this child? These are things that no other American commander in World War II has to deal with, and for good reason. It's a constant concern of MacArthur's, and I do think that it has an effect on his leadership at that point. It really couldn't help but have an effect. So, he eventually gets the orders from the Roosevelt administration on February 22nd, 1942, to get out of the Philippines with his family and with select members of his staff. Of course, this is a difficult conundrum for him because he doesn't want to abandon his troops, but also, he doesn't want his wife to fall into Japanese hands. It's just a terrible situation all the way around. He ultimately will follow this order and, in early March, take his family and members of his staff out on a daring PT boat evacuation, and eventually farther south in the archipelago to Mindanao, where B-17s will take them to Australia. And MacArthur will later claim that he left on the assumption that there were going to be, major reinforcements and whatnot in Australia, that he would then immediately return to the Philippines to help in that fight. I find that personally difficult to believe, knowing a person this intelligent, knowing what was going on with the military situation. But of course, obviously, that's open to interpretation. But what is beyond question is that once he gets to Australia, he, of course, famously says, "I shall return," and this will really animate much of what he wants to do throughout the rest of the war, and begin to kind of commit the Americans to a strategy to return to the archipelago. So, as MacArthur has left the Philippines, then meanwhile, Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright will succeed him in command of Allied forces in the archipelago. Wainwright also had been born into soldiering, just like MacArthur. He was the son of a cavalry officer, the nephew of a naval officer. Wainwright came from a long tradition of military service. His nickname in the Army was Skinny, and it was a perfect nickname for him. Because he was lanky, he was courageous and inspirational. He certainly liked liquor. He had that reputation in the Army too. But he was someone who most of the troops on hand thought of as pretty inspirational. So Wainwright holds on as best he can, but obviously he's in a hopeless circumstance here in the Philippines. The troops on Bataan surrendered on April 9th, 1942. The general who had to surrender, Major General Edward Ned King, I think is interesting too, because to me, what fascinates me about history is the human side, the impact of personality on leadership, things like that really do come into play. So King is interesting because he's a Southerner, he's a Georgian with family ties to the Confederacy, who nonetheless is going to come to believe very strongly that there is no such thing as racial superiority. And that's the first thing he briefs his officers and soldiers on when they arrive in the Philippines, most of whom are white and are tempted to say, well, we're going to look down on the locals and that kind of thing. That's a possibility. And he says, hey, get that out of your mind right now. And yet he has these kind of ties to the Civil War and the Confederate side. And when he surrenders to the Japanese, ironically enough, April 9th, which was the same day 77 years earlier that Lee had surrendered to Grant, or roughly about the same time frame as Appomattox, that's all he can think of. He's thinking, I would rather die 1,000 deaths, that kind of thing. So King is really a tragic figure in that respect. And then, of course, Wainwright has to follow about a month later, surrendering the troops at Corregidor and elsewhere in the archipelago. So about 21,000 Americans and almost 4 times that many Filipinos now are consigned to the horrors of Japanese captivity. By and large, the Japanese treated them with neglect, cruelty, even outright brutality. You have obviously the infamous Bataan Death March of these troops who are captured here and are walked about 60 to 70 miles or so up here farther, into central Luzon. And I think, personally, I think it's fascinating to look at the POW experience through the experiences of this guy. This is Major, later Lieutenant Colonel Harold Keith Johnson. Now you're looking at him here in an image as a general much later in life. So at the time he's captured in 1942, he was with what was called the Philippine Scouts. Okay, so these were local soldiers recruited directly in the United States Army. They were excellent soldiers, professional soldiers, and it was considered in the archipelago typically to be a great honor to end up in the Philippine Scouts. And they were under the command and auspices and mentoring of professional American soldiers like Johnson. He was West Point, class of 1933. He served in the 57th Infantry Regiment, which again is one of the 3 Philippine or 2 Philippine Scouts infantry regiments at that point. He has served as operations officer, then a battalion commander. He's basically been a kind of do-it-all. And by this point, he has suffered a lot, and now his suffering is only beginning to be part of the Bataan Death March. The famous story, the thirst, the privation, the hunger, the low morale, the misery, the neglect, the sunning out treatments, the exhaustion, the cruel beatings and atrocities and executions and things of that nature. And so as he's on the Bataan Death March dealing with this, he's constantly thinking of his wife, Dorothy, with whom he has a very strong bond. And he's almost like having conversations with her in his mind, as a way to survive this. And the interesting thing about Johnson, as the situation got worse and worse and worse, it brought out the worst in many people. I mean, that's just the reality of war and in this kind of terrible situation. But Johnson, it was very different. In him, it brought out the best. To Johnson, ethics equated almost to life and survival. So as things got worse, he actually became more ethical. And leadership to him was very much about selflessness, professionalism, not glory in any way, shape, or form. So he becomes more ethical, in a way more spiritual. He'll later say God was very close and very real in those hours. And I think that's a very sort of moving statement about what he felt defined him at that point. The march claimed the lives of about 600 Americans and between 5,000 and 10,000 Filipinos, roughly. And that's worth mentioning too, that really it was the Filipinos who got worse treatment than the Americans. And I think sometimes as Americans, we tend to overlook that. But I think that's very important to remember. So the survivors were consigned to a terrible place called Camp O'Donnell. It's a true hellhole, where conditions were even worse than on the Death March, believe it or not. For over 2 months in that spring and summer 1942, Allied soldiers died in droves, hundreds per day, from disease, thirst, starvation, even the occasional arbitrary beating or execution. This was the speech they were greeted with, typically by the sort of third-rate, small-minded commandant, Captain Yoshio Tsunoshi. He said, "You are the eternal enemies of Japan, and we will fight you and fight you and fight you for 100 years. And then I would often say, well, you have no distinctions of rank. You have no recognition of soldiers. We don't view you as men. We don't care if you die. I mean, that's basically the attitude. So at O'Donnell, prisoners were subsisting on rice gruel, typically waiting in line all day under a hot tropical sun just for a canteen of water. Chaos reigned. It was like a Lord of the Flies environment, almost by design by the Japanese. Little leadership at all at this point, because initially the Japanese were saying officers have no status, there's no ranks, we don't care, and so obviously it's just a bad situation. In a way, the biggest thing that would imperil your life at O'Donnell was dehydration, probably more than starvation. By most accounts, there was at least an adequate amount of rice gruel, but not anywhere near enough water. You have the establishment pretty quickly of what was called the Zero Ward. There was what passed for a hospital, very bare bones operation, and the Zero Ward basically was where you went to die, as if you had, in other words, you have zero chance of survival. These were men who died awash in their own excreta, and I apologize for the graphic nature of that, but that's just unfortunately the way it was. One prisoner later reflected, "Death was easier than life. It was as easy as letting go of a rope, and a lot of people just quit hanging on." So Johnson, at this point, has survived the death march, and he falls prey to malnutrition and just a terrible case of dysentery, which, of course, obviously is going to be dehydration and kill you. He ends up in the Zero Ward, but was one of the very, very few to survive. And as he'll later put it, I don't know why, I just know that I came out. Well, many others, as he saw, were less fortunate. By the end of June 1942, 1,547 Americans had died at Camp O'Donnell, between 21 and 26,000 Filipinos. I'll say it again, between 21 and 26,000 Filipinos. The Americans had a 1 in 6 fatality ratio, the Filipinos about 1 in 3. The American survivors, most of them ended up at a POW camp at Cabanatuan, not too far away, where the high death rates persisted throughout much of the summer and early fall, until eventually you're going to see better organization, a bit more food, better medical care to help stabilize the conditions into merely poor rather than overtly deadly. The best scholar or historian of Camp O'Donnell was a guy who experienced it, a guy named John Olson, who retired as a full colonel, another West Pointer. And he titled his book, Andersonville of the Pacific. And I think that says it exactly right. It really was a kind of Andersonville environment. Of course, that's the infamous Civil War POW camp, in which many Union soldiers died. And I should point out, too, lest anyone accuse me of sympathizing one side or the other in the Civil War, both sides treated their POWs horrendously in the Civil War, and many, many died needlessly. But in Olson's point of view, the worst camp he could think of was Andersonville, and I think it was a pretty apt comparison. So what does Johnson end up doing after he survives the Zero Ward? Well, he plays a major role in that improvement at Cabanatuan that I alluded to a moment ago. He's restored to some semblance of health. I mean, granted, he's lost about 35, 40 pounds at this point, but he begins to organize an efficient, fair, and vital commissary system that procures, food, medicine, other necessities from the outside world for the betterment of the prisoners. And the interesting thing, he's unanimously chosen by his fellow prisoners for this job because of his impeccable honesty and his consideration for others. Because if he's the commissary officer, he controls so many things that are vital to life. He's a student of human nature, and he figures out how to work productively with the Japanese by ingratiating himself with them, building trust, but also, and I think this is such an ironic twist, by deceiving them too, especially in relation to finding ways to get more food, finding ways to get more money in monthly audits, all for the larger goal of the greater well-being. He creates a a sort of, I don't know what to call it, a charity fund of some sort or another, to make sure that those with more money aren't able to simply buy their way to better food and survival, that actually it's spread out among as many people as possible to save as many people as possible. And so the death rates plummeted at Cabanatuan by the end of the year and into 1943. Life stabilized and normalized. Prisoners remained hungry and underweight, prone to disease, to be sure. It was not good. But it's fair to say Johnson's efforts had helped save a lot of lives. And I think his ascent to eventually becoming Army Chief of Staff about 20 some odd years later begins right then during captivity. So the image you're looking at him here is later, when he's obviously a 4-star general and Army Chief of Staff. So he's got this kind of striking sense of ethics, empathy, accountability, and honesty. In the meantime, beyond the viewpoint of these prisoners, you have this mass theater that I had mentioned earlier. And, it's like, okay, how do you even control that? How do you administrate it? How are you going to fight this huge oceanic and islandic and continental war against the Japanese? Well, the War Department basically splits up the theaters into, Nimitz's area here, Admiral Chester Nimitz. You can see North Pacific area, Central, South Pacific area, and you can just imagine that's just staggering to try and control. So Nimitz will have naval, marine, and Army forces under his command, Army Air Forces, of course, too. And he'll have an island hopping campaign with the idea of trying to get to Japan. On the Asian continent, you have, as I mentioned moments ago, an alliance with Chiang Kai-shek and China. The idea being, let's make sure to tie down as much Japanese manpower here in China as possible, and let's build a bulwark in China that China will become the sort of key American ally in Asia after the war and stabilize the continent. And the other thing to remember too, the Japanese had basically, just like the Germans in Europe, elected to fight a 2-front war. They had attacked China, and so that's a front, and now they had attacked the Western allies, including the USA, and obviously now that's the Pacific front too. So the whole idea of Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell's mission to China is to keep China in the war, keep it supplied, tying down Japanese manpower, and look forward to this larger kind of Asian future. MacArthur's role in this, the Southwest Pacific area, or SWAPA, using Australia as the base, and eventually, of course, New Guinea as the transit point to get back to the Philippines. And of course, this isn't decided by 1942. It is in MacArthur's mind, but not among the Washington policymakers. But that is MacArthur's hope. So what he wants is a counteroffensive somewhere in New Guinea in 1942 in order to begin that process. And he's operating on a shoestring with few naval resources. And at this point too, again, I think very important for us as Americans to understand the Australian role. The Australians are really carrying the load of the ground war in 1942 and 1943, and obviously as the base, kind of similar to what the British were doing in Europe as a base for this larger Allied effort. Australia, about 1 million American Australians either are based in the country. About 1 million Americans are based in Australia or passed through there in the course of World War II. Again, it's a fascinating story, a human story too. But so these allies are going to have to try and roll back the tide of the Japanese advance here, and a lot of this is going to take place on the island of New Guinea, of course. So, the other thing too, interesting in relation to MacArthur's leadership, when he left the Philippines, he was quite disaffected with both the Navy and the Army Air Forces because he felt both had let him down in that campaign. But his association and sort of really good working relationship with 2 key figures is going to start to change his thinking and lead to ultimately some really incredible inter-service operations as the war unfolds. Admiral William Halsey, of course, in the South Pacific area, who is a kind of hard-charging leader whom MacArthur will really respect, and Lieutenant General George Kenney, who will become his aerial commander. And so one of the first things Kenney is going to show him is, you know what, in New Guinea, one of the ways we can start to defeat what is difficult terrain is airlifts. And so you're looking here at Papua New Guinea. It's the sort of southeastern extreme of the island. And at this point, the Japanese had established bases on the northern coast, and they wanted to capture Port Moresby right here. Port Moresby would be a nice jump-off point to Australia, perhaps, or just help solidify Japanese control of southeastern New Guinea. The Allies had to hold on to Port Moresby, and indeed they will, and they'll use airfields there to help airlift troops across some of the most rugged terrain in the world to attack these Japanese bases on the northern coast. This is what's playing out from about August to December 1942. I'm not going to mention seasons because, of course, this is below the equator, so it's the exact opposite of what we think of as seasons in North America. So we would be tempted to call it the fall, but it's not really that. So, this is really the sort of first counteroffensive that MacArthur is going to mastermind, and it's not going well as of like October, November. Just getting troops, across this terrain on the ground is not impossible, but just a horrendous experience because it's so difficult. You're going to have problems with disease, problems with the elements, I mean, you name it. And so Kenny is masterminding this airlift across here. But once these Australian and U.S. forces are confronting a mass complex web of Japanese defenses there, they're basically going nowhere. So if you can imagine a swamp, complete sort of flooded swamps, and any dry land, any dry transit point is covered by coconut log reinforced pillboxes that have interlocking fields of fire, and practically any, sort of hard level fortification that you can have in that tropical environment, that's what you're looking at. Okay, and so the concern that MacArthur has is very, very significant. See, he's really worried that the Japanese are going to win at Guadalcanal. Now, if I go back to this map, you can see, okay, well, Solomon Islands, there's Guadalcanal. Of course, it's a more famous battle than what's going on in Papua New Guinea. But at that point, you see this struggle going on between the Allies and the Japanese for control of Guadalcanal, because they need the airfield there, because they want to control these sea lanes, just a whole sequence of things. And Guadalcanal, by the way, is a classic example of what I'm talking about. We associate the ground fighting with the Marines, but in the end, the Army does the majority of the ground fighting in the Battle of Guadalcanal as it plays out, like in November, December 1942 and in January 1943. So Guadalcanal and Papua New Guinea are basically two subplots of the same story. Especially from a Japanese point of view, they get spread out too thin, and it's one of the reasons why they're going to lose at both places. But MacArthur's worried they will win at Guadalcanal, and then they'll reinforce those perimeters on the northern coast of New Guinea and bring more naval forces there. And at that point, they will reverse the tide and get across to Port Moresby. And so MacArthur is deeply concerned he's going to be dealt yet another defeat. And he's already had this sting of terrible defeat in the Philippines. It appears to be pretty ignominious, and he's getting desperate with this stalemated situation by like November 1942 here at Buna-Gona, Sanananda, but Buna is the key part of it. And so he turns to this guy, a guy he's known for a number of years, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, another West Pointer, class of 1919, to say, okay, I need dynamic on-site leadership to snuff out that Japanese base at Buna there. Eichelberger had worked for MacArthur when he was Army Chief of Staff in the 1930s. Eichelberger is a fascinating guy. He was the son of a Union veteran of the Civil War, a very prosperous lawyer farmer, and he was the youngest of multiple siblings, and he was just sort of like the adorable baby that no one took seriously. And it was something that stayed with him his whole life, wanting to achieve, wanting to prove himself, certainly to his father, eventually just to his family, eventually just as a matter of course, because that's how he was wired. In World War I, he served not on the Western Front, but in Russia, what was called the Polar Bear Expedition. It was the attempt by the Allies to snuff out the Bolshevik regime during the Russian Civil War and help the Bolsheviks' opponents, the whites. So Eichelberger had seen combat, quite a bit of it, in Siberia. He had served as an intel officer, and I think interestingly, considering his later career, he had fought alongside with and observed the Japanese. And Eichelberger was a very scholarly kind of guy, and so he had absorbed a lot of those lessons. He had married Emma Gudger, who was from a kind of upper middle class background, and they had this deep bond as tremendous soulmates. And they had no kids, They had each other, and they had Bob's career in the Army. And so Eichelberger, incredibly, found time throughout the war, even though he's very much like a frontline combat commander, he found time throughout the war to write to Emma, usually every day, sometimes twice a day. And on the eve of going to Buna was no different. So he's briefed by MacArthur in quite fiery terms, and famously MacArthur tells him, take Buna, Bob, or don't come back alive. And so, before Bob goes to New Guinea, he writes Emma, and he says, you may be sure that I shall always be with you in my thoughts. As I think of all the years we've been together, I know you must realize how my admiration, respect, and love have increased. Okay, so here's this guy, sort of at this proving point of his career as he sees it, trying to salvage this situation for MacArthur, who's breathing down his neck for results. And he gets to Buna, and this is what he sees. You look at this dizzying map here. This is where, like, all these guys are spread out from the 32nd Infantry Division, fighting these desperate small unit engagements against the Japanese and those kind of fortifications I had mentioned a moment ago. So Eichelberger finds just this terrible situation of inertia there. Fortifications are formidable, of course, but the supply situation is terrible. The soldiers are hungry. You're lucky to get maybe one can of sea rations a day. They're demoralized. The conditions are lousy. New Guinea is there's no good place to fight a war. But if we're going to fight a war, we'd probably like San Diego weather, 75 degrees and sunny. Well, New Guinea is like 95 degrees, high humidity, practically look at the place and you've got malaria, terrible jungle foliage, the swamps, the mosquitoes, the insects, just the mud, there's no infrastructure, there's nothing. You got no artillery there because it's just untenable at this stage. You don't have much in the way of sea lift. It's just really bad. So he finds that there's no patrols going out. There's this inertia. The front lines are unstable. One officer described the troops as, quote, filthy, fever-ridden, practically starved, living in a tidal swamp. And so you have a really awkward situation. The commander of the 32nd Infantry Division is a classmate and good friend of Eichelberger, Major General Forrest Harding. And yet Eichelberger had orders from MacArthur to relieve him, but Eichelberger refused to do that initially until seeing the situation for himself. And once he had seen it, he said, you know what, this is inexcusable. Forrest, I have to let you go, kind of thing. And Harding blamed Eichelberger for that for the rest of their lives. It divided their West Point class. It was incredibly awkward. But unfortunately, it probably had to be done. So Eichelberger orders a pause, improves the supply situation. That completely changed, reorganized things, and then he launches a major attack because he figures, okay, getting all this heat from MacArthur, we got to snuff out this perimeter. Let's do it. Attack. And it failed. And you realize that's never going to work. I'm going to have to take these guys down a death by 1,000 cuts. Little small unit actions, constantly putting pressure on them, and you can't mass troops for an attack. It just won't work. Sergeant Ernest Gerber, one of like a squad leader, basically said it was like this. They were practically impenetrable to our fire. And he was talking about Japanese defensive positions. You could look right into one and it looked like the jungle. Our troops could not fight as units, but rather as individuals in twos and threes, an operations report stated. So basically just this, like you can see in the map here, all these dizzying array of numbers. Those are little small unit actions that happen over the course of December 1942. And Eichelberger is not just sitting back in a tent somewhere. He's out there leading them each day with a Tommy gun in hand or an M1 carbine in hand, risking his life. He comes close to death on many occasions. And a lot of what he's doing is just trying to prod people forward when they don't want to go forward, like a squad leader almost. He loses 30 pounds in a month. He writes to Emma once or twice a day. And one of the things he writes about is the rains. Torrential rains are pouring down almost every day on these guys. He writes, no one could remember when he had been dry. The feet, arms, bellies, chests, armpits of my soldiers were hideous with jungle rot. And that's another thing. The 32nd Infantry Division came from cold weather climates. It was mainly Wisconsin, northern Illinois, and some Michigan National Guard. And I think this is funny. This is so Army. You'd figure, okay, well, they're going to go to a cold weather climate and fight there in Europe or something. But no, let's take the guys from a cold weather climate and put them into this tropical environment. And I think That's a classic example of sort of army square peg into a round hole sort of thing. But these guys then had to learn to live with it and had to adjust and overcome. So they're doing that. They're incredibly courageous. And I think that it's fair to say Eichelberger is sort of the key personality. He's a major reason why this thing is moving at all. The good news is that by the second half of December, the Japanese were even in worse shape because they were starting to lose at Guadalcanal. They were not able to start to reinforce these perimeters. So if you were a Japanese soldier there, at this point, you're diseased, you're malnourished, you're dying in droves. And a lot of these guys then took to their diaries to write their last thoughts. And again, it's very poignant, but it also gives you an insight into what was happening. What a discouraging and miserable state of affairs, Sergeant Kiyoshi Wada told in his diary. Trees have fallen, limbs have been cracked, and the hospital's in a horrible plight. What is going to happen to us? Another soldier sadly wrote, every day my comrades die one by one and our provisions disappear. Quite a few penned farewell letters to loved ones. Of course, none of the letters, or few, if any, ever got through. But this one I think is especially moving. I would like to write a few lines before I die, one told his wife. You have a fine soul, one that is rare in this world. By chance, you married unworthy me, and you devoted yourself faithfully to me. I will always be grateful. Your devotion will have been in vain, though, as I will soon die for our country. And he did. So bit by bit, Eichelberger's men gnawed away at this Japanese perimeter, captured the key objectives. So the fighting finally ends on January 3rd with the annihilation of the Japanese garrison, complete annihilation. The Americans buried hundreds of their bodies. Again, this is graphic, I apologize, but this is what it was. Some are swollen yellow-green carcasses. Tech Sergeant Dave Richardson, a Yank magazine correspondent, wrote, others are sun-bleached skeletons with tattered clothing covering their white bones. So by the time that happened, by the time the resistance runs out on January 3rd, Eichelberger has now won the first American ground victory in World War II. And I think this is largely forgotten today, and I think that's unfortunate. He had yearned for publicity. One of his West Point classmates is much more famous than he, George Patton. They were very good friends. And of course, they both thirsted for military glory. But Eichelberger was not as self-destructive and not as ruthless, I think you could say. But he wanted his own just desserts. And he expected laudatory treatment from MacArthur, whom he felt he had produced results for. But MacArthur was not the type who really wanted to share the limelight. And so when Eichelberger started getting publicity, MacArthur will sideline him to help train troops for about 9 months or so before really needing him again in combat later in the next year at Hollandia and afterwards. But so this begins a kind of interesting relationship. They got along very well, really, in terms of their interpersonal relations. Eichelberger, I think you could say, liked serving under MacArthur in some ways, but he also built an enormous resentment toward him. He served him loyally, but he was disturbed by what he felt was MacArthur's dishonesty or duplicity and his own hungriness for publicity, which, of course, Eichelberger wanted too. But they will have a long relationship serving together for the next 6.5 years or so until Eichelberger's retirement in 1948. So, you've inherited New Guinea now. That's what you're going to be doing, is advancing across New Guinea for about the next 2 years or so in the wake of this. And it's just a terrible place to be, but you have to do it if you're going to get back to the Philippines and start to reverse the Japanese control of the South Pacific. It's one of the most underdeveloped places on the planet, teeming with diseases, no infrastructure, crushing heat and humidity, jungles, mountains, swamps. This image, I think, gives you a really good sense of that. And Lieutenant General Brian Somerville, the commander of Army Service Forces, I think put it really well. He said the Army is really fighting two battles, one against the enemy and the other against the jungle. And that's exactly what you got at New Guinea. Average annual rainfall spanned between 100 and 150 inches. Temperatures climbed into the 90s and beyond. Jungles and swamps teemed with insects and environmental-borne diseases, so much so that I view the Pacific War as, to some extent, an interspecies war. Some 54% of all hospital admissions were due to disease. I think this is really easy to relate to today in our pandemic world when we see what disease can do. The Army in the Pacific at this point, especially throughout like 1943 in New Guinea, is just dealing with a terrible disease situation. The Army was losing 5 men to malaria for every 1 in combat against the Japanese. And, you know, fortunately, malaria was usually not fatal by this point in history, though the Americans lost 12,000 man days per month to it. When a soldier went down with malaria, on average, he spent 25 days in the hospital, though, and usually it recurred. Scrub typhus became a problem, too. It was spread by these little mites that was on the tropical grass, and it was more serious in terms of mortality. It had a 5% fatality rate. And you know, it was the first time the Army had dealt with scrub typhus. In late 1943, 17 malaria control units, composed of like epidemiologists, entomologists, biologists, began to try and fight this malaria problem throughout New Guinea. Sprayed insecticides, what were called bug bombs. You can imagine how that smelled and how toxic that must have been. They began to flame like mosquito breeding areas with diesel oil. But, you know, it was impossible to eliminate all the mosquitoes. And so the real solution was pharmaceutical. Medics ruthlessly enforced regular dosage of atabrine, which didn't cure malaria, but it would suppress the symptoms. But it had some downsides. It had an occasional psychosis consequence, maybe about 1 in 1,000 or so. There were rumors that it caused sterility, and you can imagine how it would be tough to get the troops to take it then, but that was untrue. But what it did was it would yellow your skin. If you were a white person, your skin would take on this yellow tinge. So, you know, in like 1940s America, you could pick out a Pacific Theater veteran by that sort of yellowish tinge in the person's skin if he was a white person. So the medicine kept the disease somewhat under control, though obviously in a sort of uneasy way. Life in New Guinea was hard and brutal, as this image I think shows you. No amenities, really, by American standards. Morale was usually low. One battalion commander wrote his wife, I think he summed it up perfectly. He said, there are only 4 things that will keep soldiers happy: fighting, drinking, gambling, and women. And in New Guinea, there was just, you know, nowhere near enough in the quantities the soldiers wanted. Soldiers fermented their own noxious jungle juice, this sort of nasty mix of fruit juice, raisins, potato peels, and other detritus that was packed into this powerful, like 100 to 180 proof wallop. In one fairly typical unit that I found in their records, about 1/3 of the men were not only usually too drunk to go on guard duty, they were too drunk to even stand up. So that tells you how powerful the jungle juice was. There were severe cultural taboos about any fraternization with local women who were very, very dark-skinned, and so white soldiers typically had no interest in them. African-American soldiers generally had no interest in them. So venereal disease rates were almost nil in New Guinea, whereas in Australia, in some units, they were as high as 1/3, believe it or not. Such was the sexual tension in theater that medical unit commanders assigned armed guards to escort their few female nurses wherever they went. They're in theater by about mid-1943. Now, this was ostensibly to protect them from Japanese patrols, but in reality, as one officer admitted, quote, to discourage incidents of sexual harassment and fraternization. You know, sad sign of the times, security for the female nurses tightened whenever they were in close proximity to African-American units, as if black soldiers presented some sort of special threat to nurses, to white nurses. But that was the reality of the time, unfortunately. There's this sort of dark underbelly of depression, problem drinking, suicide, mental illnesses that festered among the troops. Neuropsychiatrists estimated that psychological problems, including psychosis and neurosis, affected between 5 and 10% of the soldiers. In one extreme case, Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Kinsler, who was the commander of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, became so despondent that he committed suicide by shooting himself in the heart and while on a date with an Australian nurse. Now, athletics helped morale immensely. Wherever the Americans developed bases, they soon established leagues for baseball, softball, football, volleyball, even ping pong. Boxing matches were common. Outdoor theaters afforded a hugely welcome diversion. You have these occasional interruption by rain, of course, or enemy air raids were pretty common. But that did nothing to dampen the enthusiasm for entertainment in the forms of movies or live productions. Over a 3-month period at one typical base, soldiers at 43 different theaters took in 453 shows, just to give you a sense of how common this was. The Army logisticians, engineers, port battalions, quartermasters worked veritable miracles just to carve out any viable bases in this place out of the New Guinea wilderness. Allied armies on the island required 340,000 tons of material just to subsist each month. So once landed, as you can kind of see in this image here, once landed, cargo could degrade from the elements, insects, mold, animals, so everything from blankets to medicine had to be protected, moved, and stored properly. By the end of 1943, engineers had constructed, nearly 750,000 square feet of warehouse storage space. So it's incredible. You have these previously barren places like Oro Bay, Milne Bay. They turn into thriving bases like many American cities. The population of Oro Bay had swelled by that point in time in late 1943 to 50,000 soldiers. The base now had 125 miles of road, 8 operational runways, 35 bridges, multiple hospitals, and 8 docks. Milne Bay was even bigger. Now, the NR-43, it boasted 12 docks, 37 bridges, 130 culverts, 10 jetties, 20,000 feet of pipeline, plus scores of administration building. MacArthur's theater, in the course of the war, received some 2.1 million measurement tons of material, just a staggering quantity that absorbed so much naval and merchant shipping that the Army even maintained its own small fleet of barges and cargo vessels, inevitably dubbed, of course, MacArthur's Navy. So where are we by that point in time? By the 1943, well, the split theaters, of course, will continue, in part as a compromise between the Army and the Navy. Nimitz's theater here, MacArthur's theater in Swapa, and obviously Stilwell doing his thing in China. The Allies have begun to turn the tide, regain some Solomon Islands. They're starting to advance in New Guinea. The war is starting to go in their direction. And the Japanese were increasingly on the defensive, tied down to try and hold on to a vast perimeter, in their empire in the Pacific. But the naval, aerial, and ground force balance of power was beginning to favor the Allies, as did, of course, the economies and the industrial numbers. So, by this time, the U.S. Army has made, a lot of mistakes, obviously, and it's still got plenty of deficiencies. But I think it's fair to say it was maturing into a formidable modern force with effective leaders who had now been tested under the most challenging of circumstances. So in short, I believe it's fair to say this Army had become characterized by its fire and fortitude. Thank you.
Good to go. Hey, John, how you doing?
Hey, Jim.
Thanks very much. That was really great. We really appreciate you doing this for us. And I think everybody found it as interesting as we did. We've got a couple of questions that people have asked during the program, so we'd like to get right to it if we could. One of the first questions, it says, Russia is close to Japan. Why didn't Stalin okay the construction of U.S. bases in Siberia?
Stalin has a peace treaty in place with the Japanese that he had signed earlier. So he has a non-aggression pact, and to allow the U.S. to build those bases would have seriously violated that non-aggression pact, and he probably would have gone to war with Japan. So he's not willing to do that throughout most of the war, as you probably know.
Right.
He agrees to get in the war towards the end in 1945.
Great. What if the strategy of island hopping was applied to Papua New Guinea as a whole, to just skip that area, maybe just neutralize the Japanese base in Rabaul? How much of it was getting pushed mainly by General Douglas MacArthur's ego and competition with Nimitz?
Well, we should never underestimate the factor of MacArthur's ego. I mean, obviously that's a big part of it, but he's also a pretty first-class strategic thinker. And if he wants to progress on to the Philippines, which of course is his main purpose in all this, and not just of course he wants that redemption. He wants to liberate the archipelago, but he truly believes in his heart that this is really the key to getting to Japan itself and defeating the Japanese. And because he understands that the Japanese are not going to make use of all the goodies they've captured in the so-called Dutch East Indies, the oil, the tin, the rubber, the bauxite, all that, if they can't control the Philippines and the sea lanes between Japan and those places. So, bypassing New Guinea is just kind of a non-starter because the size of the place, the sheer size of the place, and the ability of the Japanese then to fortify the northern coast and to use the coast as naval bases to interdict any Allied movement, north of New Guinea would have been just untenable. And so you had to at least get part of it. But the problem with New Guinea is once you get involved with any of it, you're inevitably biting off more than you not only can chew, but want to chew. And really, so he ends up dealing with it for about 2+ years.
Yeah. And also shipping at that earlier stage, there really was nothing to go anywhere. How did the Filipinos view MacArthur historically after World War II?
MacArthur, by most accounts, now I'm talking about non-communist Filipinos, I suppose. If we ask the Hooks in the 1950s, who were of course the major communist insurgents, I'm sure they're not there to troll MacArthur. But we're talking about mainstream opinion. MacArthur is viewed as a great hero, as someone who truly cared about the people and who had a family tradition there and who upheld his commitment to return and to liberate it from the Japanese. Of course, the consequence of that too was the destruction that war brought to much of the Philippines, most notably Manila. And in the second volume, I write about that in some detail too. And of course, it was terrible, but it's really not that different in that sense of what's happening in France. In order to liberate the country, unfortunately, you're having to destroy part of it. So I think overall, to answer your question, MacArthur's viewed pretty favorably.
Yeah. Can you please comment on the relationship between the U.S. Army and the Australian Army in New Guinea?
Yeah, the relationship is pretty tense as of those first few months of the Buna campaign. And that's, it's something that I didn't mention and maybe should have, is that General Harding, the commander of the 32nd Division, had not really forged productive working relationships with the Australian commanders like General Herring, for instance. And so at times they were working at cross purposes. There was some level of command tension there. There was even a little tension sometimes among the soldiers that was filtering down. And that is one thing that Eichelberger does change almost on its head. He has an outstanding relationship with Herring. He has a good relationship with his superior Blamey. And that's one of the things that does improve. And I think personally, just my interpretation is that the average American soldier and the average Australian combat soldier fighting on the front get along pretty well throughout World War II. And
the closer you get to the front, the more combined they are. Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt.
What's your assessment of Eichelberger's book, Our Jungle Road to Tokyo?
I think it's a really first-class war memoir. And what surprised me about it a little bit, Jim, is that he even got any help from a writer, from Milton McKay, who was not necessarily a first-rank writer of that era. And Eichelberger had such writing skills that I don't know that he really needed someone else to tell the story. I think it's a fascinating read, and his history, it's really pretty good because Eichelberger kept such minute records of himself too, partially through his communications with Emma, but also the diary he kept, and Eighth Army's records too, ultimately, which he commands, are pretty first rate. So I think I would highly recommend Our Jungle Road to Tokyo.
Excellent. Had the USAFE retreated to Bataan immediately, would that have also prevented the redeployment of major Japanese units to other fronts with particular impact on the subsequent campaign?
Yeah, it's an intriguing question. I think it certainly would have done the Japanese no good because that army in Bataan would have held out longer because they would have been in a better shape logistically. Now, they would have probably been doomed in the end over time, but let's say we're looking at another 6 months or so. Now you're talking about better Allied naval power that's going to be in play, and you're talking about the siphoning of Japanese resources, maybe from Burma, maybe from the South Pacific. I mean, of course, it's all just hypothetical.
Right.
I don't think there's any question that it would have been worse, and who knows, maybe Hama would have been fired outright at that stage. I don't
Considering the supply situation with the Air Force in USAFE, wasn't loss of air superiority inevitable even if the December 8 attacks had been less successful?
Yeah, I mean, also a really fair point, but similar to the previous question, in that maybe the MacArthur's air assets can protract the campaign some more and inflict more damage, especially upon Japanese shipping. Now, I realize it's the B-17s are not ideal for bombing shipping at that point in time, but they still are a threat, and they're certainly a threat to any ground forces that are landing. And so I think the biggest thing that the loss of the air, if we'll call it that, much of it on the ground, is the loss of initiative. The Japanese really have the offensive initiative from that point forward. But the point about supply is a really good one. If you're not able, I mean, of course, to run aerial operations takes tremendous logistics, and certainly that would have been an issue eventually. Yeah.
You've written a lot about the troops in Europe. How would you compare their morale to troops in the Pacific theater?
Yeah, I think the morale in Europe is a little higher because there's better outlets for you. There's more infrastructure. There's better places to go and drink in a bar. There's more women.
Yeah.
There are more amenities. It's a deadlier war in the sense of the potency of the enemy and the various places to fight and die, and the protracted nature of combat for combat units in continental operations. So I do think their morale tends to be higher, especially than New Guinea. And admittedly, when I'm discussing New Guinea tonight, I'm discussing sort of the nadir, and obviously the Philippines before that. But this is the roughest place to be. It's if we're talking later on about, say, the 7th Infantry Division invading Kwajalein, it's a fairly quick campaign. It's sharp, it's tough combat, and then you're back to a rear area. And so, so the Pacific combat might have tended to be more episodic throughout much of the war, and that could help morale. But I do think that the amenities were the biggest difference.
Yeah, the green hell that you're always in. You're always in. What is your perspective on who is responsible for the loss of the airplanes on the ground at Clark?
Yeah, my perspective on that is simply that MacArthur is the commander, and the buck stops with him. And I know that not everything that happens is, strictly speaking, his fault. But to me, the biggest mistake he makes is he allows Sutherland to kind of wall him off from the outside world. And I think that was unfortunate. Louis Brereton is certainly not in the first rank of any air commanders, and there's plenty of blame to go to him. But he's a slippery eel too. He's able to get out of the Philippines, to kind of spin this whole thing. He has some pretty big commands throughout the rest of the war, and MacArthur also is able to kind of sidestep that too. Then it becomes that kind of afterthought in the view of the many people.
Right. I have long discussed with my opinion that MacArthur was the most lied to U.S. general of World War II. He was not in a position to operate in the Philippines as people believe. He was told many times, fight on, we are sending relief, and it was incumbent upon him never to express whether he was in any doubts that this may not happen. Simply put, the lies he was told out of Washington had to be passed along as gospel truth down all the channels of command. It would have been insubordination to express any alternate view. What do you say about the constraints of theater commanders?
I think it's a fair point about the disingenuousness of some of the communications he's getting, even from George Marshall.
Yeah.
That are sort of implying that he's going to get that reinforcement and resupply and all that. So I think that's a very fair point. Now, if we're talking later in the war, I don't know that he's really getting lied to as much there. Right. But I think the constraints of any theater commander is, of course, to fight for resources for his command and priority for his command. And MacArthur is going to quite naturally do that. I believe sometimes quite myopically in not necessarily realizing the importance of the European theater too. But I also kind of get his point that, especially in 1942, when he's wondering, why are we giving resources to the Soviet Union when my guys in the Philippines are rotting? And, of course, that makes absolute sense. But it's all a byproduct of the terrible situation that we're in at that point in the war. So I certainly understand some of MacArthur's frustrations with Washington, but I also think that he had a tendency to engage in a bit of paranoia of just sort of dismissing Washington people conspiring against him, and without like specifics. if it was boiled down, maybe he's talking about Ernie King, who hated MacArthur, but Hauser didn't really hate King that much, but King hated MacArthur for whatever reason. So certainly that was not a friend of his, I suppose.
Right. When considering General MacArthur's ego, is that personal trait unique, or is ego more symptomatic of many successful military leaders? Examples, Patton, Montgomery.
Yeah, I mean, certainly ego is in play for a lot of these guys in order to do that kind of job and that kind of war. But I might suggest that he's first among equals when it comes to ego. He is. It's interesting because he certainly has these insecurities too that you see, but he's just this massive ego, and it's sometimes his undoing. So I think some of his colleagues who had egos too and did a little bit better job of covering it up, because I mean, let's be honest, of course Eisenhower would have had some ego too, but I
all
think
of them did.
all of them. That's a great point.
Well, you don't want a general who doesn't believe in himself,
That's right, you really don't. That's a great point. Yep.
This is a good one. If MacArthur had not been considered a hero in the press, would he have been fired after the loss of the Philippines?
I think that's, a very strong possibility. Americans don't like losers, and at that point, some people could have viewed him as a loser. And I don't know that would have been fair, but they might have viewed him that way. And it's what Wainwright had worried about, that, in their captivity, he thought, well, I'm going to be court-martialed because I lost and I surrendered and all this. And so maybe that's MacArthur in that circumstance. I don't know, but I do think it's interesting to speculate what might have been different if he didn't have his family with him, and if there wasn't that kind of cult of personality around him that turned him into a national hero. And it would have, in the view of the Roosevelt administration, been so devastating to lose him to Japanese captivity, and not much less Gene and Arthur as well.
Yeah.
If he's just a guy, who knows? Who knows? Yeah.
Do you think that the brutality experienced in the Pacific Theater was due to Japanese culture, ideology, or was this level of brutality also found in the European theater?
It is somewhat found in the European theater on the Eastern Front.
Yeah.
That is a no-holds-barred struggle, but I think it's worse in the Pacific too, in many respects. When you're talking about beheadings and just the incredible shabbiness of the treatment of the Japanese, of their POWs. Japanese, I'm not going to say it's Japanese culture, but there's no doubt in my mind that Japan, in a way, had been sort of hijacked by this military adventurist clique and this kind of hyper nationalism, and of course there had been a kind of understandable resentment of the Western powers built up over decades, and denying Japan its rightful place and all that kind of stuff too. All of this plays out, but I also think, and I don't pretend to be a psychologist or anything, but I do think there's a factor in play here, and I explored this a little bit in the part about the book that covers the Bataan Death March, of the brutality of some of the Japanese soldiers, and made the point that very few of them would have gone to the Philippines with this intention, and yet they behaved this way. And part of it was I think the sort of brutalization they had within the military hierarchy, of abuse.
Culture in the army rather than the culture of Japan itself.
Yeah, exactly. Two different things in that sense. And the culture of the army had become this sort of aggressive and barbaric thing in some respects.
Yeah. You talked about MacArthur's not moving the rice down to Cabanatuan. And then also later on, he doesn't shell Cavite because Quezon doesn't want him to when the Japanese are pulling in artillery there. Why do you think that MacArthur was so beholden to Quezon and his wishes?
It's, in one respect, it's laudable because he's respecting Philippine sovereignty, I think, in this sense, and certainly his relationship with Quezon and the idea that the Filipinos and their perspective matters in his strategic considerations. Quezon is worried about morale factors if the rice is removed to Bataan, and certainly, obviously, whether his people are going to get fed. And so MacArthur is, out of consideration for the Filipinos, deferring to Quezon. But I also think he's kind of taking his eye off the ball a little bit in terms of looking out for his army and its general welfare too, and his fighting acumen, and his larger mission of defeating the Japanese. It's a tough choice, and whether they could have gotten the rice there is another factor altogether. But we might suggest that perhaps they could have tried.
This is another question that kind of adds on to that one. It says a further aspect concerning the 10,000 tons of rice at Cabanatuan. U.S. theater commanders in a country which is not in a declared war do not have powers to command lawfully overrule elected presidents. MacArthur could not overrule Philippine laws. The disposition of the rice across provincial lines was covered by legislation, not simply by Quezon's caprice. Your view?
My view is the war is declared at that point as of December 8th, and of course all this is post December 8th, and that perhaps could be the game changer at that point that could allow him to appropriate that rice. I guess maybe the shame of it is that Quezon didn't want the rice removed. If he had, then probably there wouldn't have been much of a problem.
Right. MacArthur takes credit for Operation Cartwheel's Triphibious operations. This question wants to know, should more of the credit be with Kinney?
I think some of it should be with Kenny, yeah, because Kenny's air forces are what marginalize, Rabaul and thus make Cartwheel ancillary. And it's funny because MacArthur is kind of good sometimes at rewriting history, and he was all for going after Rabaul initially.
Yes, he was.
And then obviously, to his credit, he becomes less interested after seeing that there's really no purpose to this and it's going to lead to bogging down. And I think the main reason for that is Kenny. And Kenny kind of convinces him, you don't need this, you can move on elsewhere. Kenny, I think, is a really good influence on MacArthur in a lot of ways. And, so that is a pretty productive relationship.
I think he gets him back in the game. I think, he wasn't really in it until Kinney gets there.
Yep. Yeah, because he didn't really grasp air power at that point. Yeah.
And you point that out well, I think, in the book about Bismarck Sea, and those whack air raids of August 43 really set the stage for them being able to move around. I thought that was good. Did the I shall return save MacArthur's career rather than him saying we shall return, a 1942 version of a tweet?
It is sort of the 1942 version of a preemptive tweet, I guess. That's well put. I don't think it really saved his career. It creates a legend, and it creates an intention. It creates pressure on the Washington policymakers to make that happen. It doesn't make it inevitable, of course, but it's really quite interesting because just at this one moment, and I'm sure for those who were there, it was probably an innocuous moment. I came through and I shall return, but then it becomes I shall return, and that has connotations, so it's really quite interesting because in retrospect, you see this is not the first time, but one of the key times when he's willing to perhaps defy the policymakers in Washington. That perhaps ultimately leads to April 1951, in Korea and all that, because MacArthur is going to want to make a lot of his own policy too. And maybe that's a kind of a harbinger.
Kind of expressing strategy before they've really gotten into strategy yet, yeah. Do you think that the American and Filipino forces might have defeated the first Japanese invasion had food been stored in sufficient amounts on Bataan once MacArthur's forces moved back into there?
It depends how we define defeating the invasion. I don't think they ever would have repelled them at the waterline, but I think they certainly could have bogged it down for longer, and perhaps that represents a defeat for the Japanese in that sense. As I mentioned tonight, is that they don't necessarily lose because of tactical deficiencies or because they're defeated in battle tactically all that much as the logistics. And so if the logistics are better, it does stand to reason that they're going to do better battle-wise. But I don't think that under any scenario, once Pearl Harbor has happened, that they're going to be able to rebuff the Japanese invasion altogether.
Yeah. In 1943, didn't Admirals Barbie and later Kincaid, as well as General Kruger, who had extensive inter-service experience, also contribute to the effectiveness of SWAPA Triphibious operations?
Absolutely. All of them key players. Yeah, no doubt. And of course, Admiral Barbie becomes known as Dan the Amphibious Man. He is, it's quite interesting when you look at how SWAPA develops. MacArthur does cultivate these very productive relationships, starting with Halsey and Barbie. Kenny, of course, Kruger becomes MacArthur's protege in a way, his land protege. And of course, this is a sort of story for the next volume is this rivalry that develops between Kruger and Eichelberger.
Right.
Two very different kinds of people and commanders whom MacArthur, I think, sort of manipulates but uses very well.
Definitely.
I don't see any kind of equivalent on the naval aerial side. He's going to settle around his guys, and they're going to work pretty well together. Admiral Kincaid, too. Yeah, that's another. I think he deserves a lot of credit as well.
Most definitely. Most definitely. This is a comment of a big what if. If MacArthur was immediately told that reinforcements will not be arriving in the Philippines 41-42 and he drops going to Bataan and goes instead towards north to the Cagayan Valley of Luzon, he wants to know, do you think they could have held out later? Kind of like Yamashita did and the way the Philippine Army did in 1899, 1900.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, provided the logistics are there, I don't think there's any question that perhaps he could have, and that perhaps then, it's intriguing to think if MacArthur would have thought in terms of insurgent or guerrilla warfare. It's something he kind of comes back to once he's gone, expecting Wayne
like right off.
To do it.
Yeah.
And obviously eventually, and I think this is one of the really fascinating sides of his war, is the support ultimately for Filipino insurgent forces operating that become more and more important as we get closer to the invasion in 1944. So yeah, I don't think there's any reason why he wouldn't have been able to hold out there for a substantial amount of time. Yeah.
In your research, did you ever come across anything like the War Department ever thought of the Cagayan Valley option over Bataan? Or were they just mostly thinking that Manila Bay? Yeah.
I think they want Manila Bay. And so Bataan is the key to that. And they've built up Corregidor, and Corregidor is sort of the key to that whole thing too. So I never saw anything. I'm not prepared to say it. No one ever thought of that, but we're playing orange centered certainly around Bataan.
Here's a comment to support Mr. McManus, Dr. McManus. Foreign affairs decisions still reside with the U.S. government despite Commonwealth status of the Philippines during World War II. I guess that's just a comment.
Thank you.
Finally, why was Leyte chosen as the landing site for General MacArthur, given geography and other issues?
Yeah, it's at the sort of central part of the archipelago, and the thinking was you can sort of cut it in half, and you can have a perfect base from which to move on Luzon. They had originally, of course, intended to invade at Mindanao, and that would have been a big bite. That would have been a very rough invasion. Leyte itself is bad enough. And Leyte, what the Americans didn't realize when they invaded is that the Japanese are going to almost impetuously decide to reinforce it, and that's why it ends up as terrible as it does. But the other thing too, I don't think the Americans quite grasp until they're there, is just what a lousy place it is base wise and infrastructure wise and staging.
That rain.
Oh, God, the rain is just horrible. Absolutely. Yeah.
One of the things in the book you talk a lot about Guadalcanal as well, and J. Lawton Collins, and how he did a great job out there, but he's really hot to get to Europe. And a lot of people really criticized him for it out there. Was he lobbying at all to get out of there while he was working in the Pacific?
He is. He's back channel lobbying because he's got a lot of friends, throughout the Army. He's become convinced that air power is really going to decide practically everything in World War II. And he believes that if you end up in the Pacific, you're not going to do anything else besides babysit air bases as things progress up the islands. And so he viewed in an odd sort of way Guadalcanal as an almost climax of the ground war in the Pacific, when of course that's not what happens at all.
Yeah.
And yes, he was lobbying, and he's an interesting dude because he's very self-interested and ambitious, but he's also a first-rate troop leader.
Yes.
Not going to sacrifice him on the horns of his ambition or anything.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, he's also quite good for an historian because he has so much correspondence and so many different places where he records his thoughts of what he wanted to do at the various times, and obviously he's a lot of different parts of this war.
Yeah.
He's an interesting guy.
No, I thought that was a real great part of the book, when the Army gets into Guadalcanal, that the second phase, after the 1st Marine Division leaves. I mean, a lot of people don't know about that, and that was just a nightmare beyond all nightmares.
Horrendous, absolutely horrendous.
Yeah,
especially later
that
on,
was real good.
Austin and the galloping horse and all that. Yeah, I appreciate that. I wanted to really develop that and to try and tell that story in a parallel with Buna, because they're both happening on the same, and from a Japanese point of view, it's the same campaign.
Yeah.
We don't look at it that way because it's two different commands.
Right.
So I wanted to kind of flip it a little bit and tell it from that perspective and show that this is high stakes for the Japanese, and why they lose in a way is because they're spread too thin.
Yeah. And then as well, your book deals a lot with Stilwell and Chenault and, Chang in China. And you talk about how Chenault really is able to carry what he wants to do over Stilwell. And is that all personality? I mean, is it just his ability to talk that allows that, or what?
Chenault is definitely better in a meeting.
Yeah.
Stilwell, for all his flamboyance and his intelligence, when he sat down in these policy meetings, he just wasn't good. He could not argue his strategy well. He had, there's an infamous White House meeting where it seems like he's ill, and they're like, "What's up with this guy?" And nobody.
Yeah, he said that he was just like looking. What was the deal? I mean, was he?
I wish I could tell you, because
Yeah.
I've wondered it myself, but that he just couldn't seem to tell
Communicate.
argue his point. Whereas Chenault too, and I think this is interesting in light of larger American perspective. Chenault is offering that air power silver bullet that American policymakers love so much. So he's trying to say, hey, give me a few hundred planes and I can win the war against Japan. And it's ludicrous, but it's exactly what the policymakers want to hear, rather than a bloodbath all the way across the Pacific. And so we're going to try the same thing in Korea and Vietnam and all this kind of stuff. And air power is great, really important, but it's not the magic bullet in that sense. Chenault then has to kind of backpedal from that 9 months later, even though his 14th Air Force is a major contributor to Allied victory, and he leads it extremely well. He's just over-promising, is what I argue.
Right. Now, when are you looking at publication of the next book?
Well, we're hoping maybe by the end of next year. You never know whether COVID's a game changer, game table and all that. I'm approaching writing the last parts of it now, and it's been quite an odyssey, because it's obviously an even bigger story once you get 44 and 45, and I just think it's amazing. So that's the tentative timetable, maybe the end of next year.
So it'll just be a 2 volumes?
Yeah.
Okay, because I'd said trilogy in the beginning, and I'm sorry for that mistake.
Oh, that's no problem at all. No, it'll be 2 volumes, and so the second one covers 1944 and 45.
Great. Now, where can everybody get it?
They can get it on all the usual places, the e-tailers like Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, in Barnes and Noble. You can get it through my website, which takes you to these various places.
Right, very good.
John C. McManus. I mean, and of course you can get it if you're an Audible person, you like to listen instead of read. You can get it that, and Kindle versions. It's available in every way, shape, and form. So I appreciate everybody's interest.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you being with us tonight, and we wish you all the best. And thanks for doing this for us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a true pleasure, Jim. Thank you.
Great. All right, take care.
Yeah, you too.
Bye, everyone.